In the initial stretch of trying to make this film, when we were focused on theatres, we were looking at the theatre archives, right? Desperately looking for old brochures, playbills, photographs, openings, all of this stuff. And it was very exciting. It is very exciting because, it's something that's not as documented as it needs to be. We have such a rich tradition. I know now that there is a film museum in Bombay, but still, the idea of unearthing all of that was very exciting. And in fact, in Calicut, I found a lot of it in one person's personal collection, who is a Hindi film music enthusiast. Uh, so you never know where you're going to find it. But then what started happening as we started, deepening where we were going with the film and looking really at that, not as architecture, not as buildings, not as only heritage sites, but sites where people engage, where people actually see films, see each other, stand in the same popcorn line, watch the same films, laugh together, cry together, uh, emote, all of that. Uh, when we started looking at that, then I started feeling that where is the archive of people's memories? We talk about the single screen cinema vanishing, but we actually haven't done an archive of, there are, for instance, specific films, like theatres, like when Regal was closing in Delhi, they did a last show, there are some lovely bites of people coming for it and talking about, Zamane mein humne dekha tha, and we went to the cinema when I was a child, but you don't have sort of a wider scape of people's memories. So I started looking at it as that, and then started seeing their personal stories and their personal photo archives and how they influence, like Javeer's character, where the whole family is into film and photography, and you know, and the fact is, it does frame a lot of us. So I started seeing it like that, and then it became very, very exciting because then sky's the limit, And then you're looking also at creating more informal archive or valuing people's narratives or people's memories. And let's face it, that is one of the ways where even archiving is going, is about people's memories, people's knowledge of these things. I love that in the film, the trade analyst who talks about हिंदी फिल्में कैसे चलती हैं and भोजपुरी फिल्में कैसे चलती हैं is one of the characters who's just an audience member. But it's like cricket, where everybody has an opinion. Film, probably more people have an opinion. And I think that is what I wanted to capture with it. So that's why I say that this is sort of an archive. And for me, it's one of many possible archives of the movies, right? Um, so it's one. I'm not saying it is the archive. There is no such thing for me as a definitive archive. It's always growing. I mean, I've worked on community archive projects where you speak to some people, and then because you share some things of what they say, then more people speak. So it's, for me, it's always a growing. It has the potential always to grow. So I see my film as one of potentially many that may happen. See, that's a very large subject, because I feel like for me it is, and that's actually why I use the clips, because I feel like you need to make those connections, because we need to need to recall those connections that we have. And so for me it was also, so each of them, I was looking at it yesterday after a stretch of time, and seeing that why did I make the choice of this film clip or the other, or the third. So for instance, the one where there is a story about Bawarchi and someone seeing it in Calcutta, the reason I actually kept that entire opening credit sequence is also to recognize who all it takes to make a film, because we forget how many levels of tech people are involved, and we have a bunch of monkeys all around us. So hopefully they will leave us alone. So, I feel like that is the connection we make as human beings, because finally the apparatus may be non-human, as you call it, but the stories it tells you, whether they're real, whether they're phantasmical, whether they are aspirational, whether they are whatever kind, those are human stories. And I think that it becomes a tech that tells you those kind of stories, and that's sort of important. So I feel that that's why we make a connection. We don't so much make a connection to the sorry, I'll just ignore that. To the technology behind it. We don't so much make a connection to the technology or the architecture. We experience it, like the architecture of one theater versus the other. Something is more inviting, something is more intimidating, something is more friendly, something is more chum-like, something you'll go with your pals, some you'll go with your families. It depends on who else comes to the theatre. You know, there's all of these variables. So you are experiencing it, but in a visceral kind of way, maybe subconscious, maybe conscious, right? But that's because the net result is that human experience. So for me, it's not about cinema being a technology or an apparatus which is non-human. Even the stories of the archives that you see in the film, like that register. Yesterday I heard so many people respond to that register because it is beautiful to see it. You know about a film called 10,000 Bedrooms, written in somebody's handwriting in 1950s, or whatever, Ben-Hur, whatever. You find yourself responding because there's both the trace of the human in that so-called non-human, piece of paper, and those traces of the human are what make it really interesting. It's like I remember the excitement when I first walked into Palace Cinema and saw these houseful kathappas in the register. It was just physical because I'm like, so exciting. Just so exciting to see it. And that's what I mean. So it's so much about the human experience. And I think that's really where what I was trying to capture, that it's not necessarily about the tech. It's not necessarily about the kind of theatre, building. It's not necessarily about the story on the screen, but it is about our shared experience of those things put together cumulatively, which is why the descriptor is actually the theatres, the movies, and us. Because it is not about the movies first. It is about the theatre space, and then it's about the movies that that become the connective tissue between us. See, the shift was always part of the story because that complexity was always part of the story. In fact, that's why I chased the story of the people. As I said yesterday, we were looking at how film travels. How does Hindi film migrate to a place like Kerala? Why is it being shown in the 1950s? It becomes a question to ask yourself, right? How did English cinema arrive in India? Why should we take it as a given that just because we were a colonial force that somehow because it wasn't that simple. Troops came in, therefore, a British administration were there, but they weren't enough to bring films that they would show in a club. So why was there public cinema, right? So you start tracing those as you see those. And one of the big origins is the World War, right? With troops coming in, being stationed all over the country, and then it speaks to the aspirational, it speaks to the global person who were there, because under the empire, there were people from many countries doing business here, right? Business and trade. So then, once you start looking at that, then you're looking at how does it move? Then how does Bhojpuri cinema become such a big force? It's because there's massive migrant populations who are then being able to connect with that cinema in a way that even Hindi cinema doesn't speak to them. So that complexity was always part of the story. Likewise, the question of women, they sound like sweet stories, but the women's roles in Calicut are actually very different from the balcony in Lucknow, because Lucknow is a time of segregation between men and women. It's a Muslim dominant area. It's women in burqas. So the idea that women would be would be opening up their burqa to watch the film, therefore they cannot sit between men. So when Sanjay Kapoor says कि वो culture का ज़माना, तहज़ीब का ज़माना था, he's actually talking about traditionalism, right? So the seeds in the so-called nostalgia are already planted as a filmmaker for me. I'm planting the seeds already. The viewer may be taking it more as something that's a sweet story. And it's an amazing story. I'm so happy I found Ashok Cinema and such an amazing person to speak about it. But the fact is, it is already then talking about how audiences are variated. When somebody in Calicut tells us that it was either the rich Gujaratis or the poor Muslims or Muslims in Kerala, who were Quran reading and therefore knew some Urdu and therefore could understand Hindi, it explains why Sahab Bibi or Ghulam ran Silver Jubilee in Crown. So but there's a huge difference between the Keralite Muslim and the rich Guju. So those segregations are already there. I'm just not highlighting them as segregations. I'm trying to tell you that, okay, there were various people. Then you come to the obvious, because in my own lived history, I have known of the tensions, the whole anti-migrant tensions in Bombay, first against the Tamils, and then against the Bhojpuri speaking Eastern UP, Bihar, people. And Ek Bihari actually saw a lot of violence in theatres. Not a lot, but it saw some violence in theatres. And so then they become organically an extension of where you're going, and those stories then need to be told. So it's an interesting juxtaposition that there is an ethnic tension followed by a sexuality and morality tension on fire, because that was also, you know, part of what we're looking at. And then as I was making this film, Kashmir Files was happening, and I will say it was happening to us as a people, right? Where there was active mobilization of people to come and do and be precisely this aggressive inside a theater. And I am saying I did not experience it in the theater. But I was just like sitting there paralyzed, thinking, what must it feel like? Right? It's okay if you're a Muslim, for instance, or a Kashmiri who passes for being more mainland or being more non-specifically Muslim. But imagine if I just went in to see Kashmir Files as a Muslim person who was visibly Muslim. Heaven help me, you know. And then what that space as being so threatened. Finally, fire, they actually demolished theaters. But this is now a different kind of aggression. Yeah. And then, of course, then there is a sort of a reclamation for all of us, more secular, whatever people, with the Pathan moment. So, so for me, the complexities were always there. It's just how I chose to. I also chose to structure the film like that, because I felt that once you bring in that, you can't go back to the old stories. So more than nostalgia, again, I see it as sort of recording those histories of those theatres. Much has been done, but I wanted to take a range of theatres which have, so that we get a sense of what is the landscape, what was cinema viewing like at that time, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you know, pretty much pre-multiplex. So they're actually stories across those entire decades. And then you come to, as you come to more contemporary times, because I also felt that the more contemporary tensions will be more relatable, you know. And for me also material, you know, narratives, all of that became more easy to get people to talk, to get people who could talk about it. Yeah, you know, I think one of the things was that as you know, the long time period was both a gift and a challenge. I will say that very clearly, because it was a challenge, because normally when I finally get into a film, like I can be ruminating on it for a very long time, and I often do a fair amount of work before I even put a proposal out. Um I know where I'm going. I may change it entirely, but I know where I think I'm going at that point. This film didn't start really as a film. It started as an architecture historian and art and film critic friend of mine and me exploring this, having access to some cinemas in Bombay, and then getting thinking about, okay, where else can we, you know, let's meet here, there, let's sort of get a lay of the land, and just it was actually just a scholarly enterprise, unencumbered by the load of making a film. But I think as it developed, I think I realized that I did not want to only stay with the stories that we started with, and so did Mary. We started realizing that there was all these layers which were really moving us, and they became really, really important to us, you know, to look at people, to look at migration, to look at audiences, because in every recounting, all of us were talking as audience, even to each other. The crew was talking to each other as audience while we were shooting buildings, right? We were trying to imagine experiences, you know, like in Capital, you know, what, my God, what would have actually been for a Hathi to come into that theater, because you're standing in the physical space. Where, may I tell you, like, I think Dhoom 2 ka opening sequence was shot, the Jackie Shroff magician thing. And in fact, all the red and gold and all is also is left over of that shoot, which is, it looks more run down by the time we did Bittu's interview, you know. So I feel there's all, you know, so it's, you're surrounded by the contemporary mind, but you're in this old space. So you're already thinking back and forth, right? And so then as it started developing, we kept working. And the problem with getting small grants is sometimes you do an interview now, but you go back to their family a year later, 1.5 years later, by which time they have moved, you have moved, you know. It's so some of those are little challenging. And and because you don't know how, there isn't a discrete amount of money, there isn't a timeline. This was a self-driven, I mean, we'd raise money at every step of the way. kind of project, so there's no end deadline. And I have to tell you, that's a terrible thing, as much as it's a wonderful thing, because sometimes I need a deadline to close, you know. So you know, it's a mixed one, but I think it allowed us to think and grow and filter, because you know, it's the kind of subject where I can come to a festival like this, I can sit in a classroom and do cinema theater memories, and then shoot only in my neighborhood. I can do it in uh, I can do it in one city, I can do it in every metropolis, I can do it, I mean, there's no limit, the subject is without bound, right? So everybody I meet will say, but did you not shoot in this place? Because their stories are connected there. And my point is only that can be sort of, I mean, if you resonate with it and it evokes those memories and maybe raises those questions, my job is done. You know? So that was sort of the arc of how we went about it. And I think one of the things I say about docu is that you go in with a premise, you go in with an understanding, you go in with a lens, you go in with many other things, but these are at least primary things you go in with. I feel if the process of being on the field doesn't push you back and make you change your perspective, change your lens, tweak it a little, understand something, complicate it, mess it up for you, I feel we have not done our job. As documentary filmmakers, as researchers, this is my thumb rule. If it doesn't mess with my brain, I know I've got an easy path. That I found easy subjects who are basically mouthpieces for what I want to say. Okay? If I don't have pushback, or somebody who, if I don't go to Ayodhya and meet a fairly what I would consider conservative Hindu mandir believing person, but who considers themselves secular or ghor secular, I have to reframe my understanding of secularism, right? So similarly, this also started pushing me to reframe my understanding of what is, without exoticizing small town theaters, without exoticizing the sort of disaster porn of single screen cinemas. You know, these are all rabbit holes. How do you tell that story but not get dragged into it so deep that everyone just feels nostalgic? Because for me, nostalgia is like sentiment, is not a worthwhile mission of a documentary, honestly. I feel that something has to push you to a little bit of a critical introspection of who you are, where are you placed. Because my work, I work on a very wide range of issues and very unconnected, and I've often struggled to find a thread myself. But I think that what connects them is our connection to our everyday life. So I may approach it through the question of Ayodhya, I may approach it through death penalty, I may be looking at primary school education, I may be looking at rice growing economics, you know. But the thing is that where are we implicated? Where are we located in this entire story? I think these things become very complicated and important. So I feel like when we reached that point that my brain was completely messed up with this film, I'm like, okay, now something will happen. And I feel that pushback is something you have to allow yourself to do. It's very valuable. So yesterday was my first day at DIFF, first time at DIFF, and the film was scheduled for the afternoon. So I was not very sure whether, I didn't have time to tell people about the film. I had done some last minute social media. I myself don't have much reach um, beyond my little echo chamber, but because I'm not active on it, etc., etc. So I was a little concerned whether people knew that the film existed, whether they would be interested, and then of course there's the next question of whether they will like it. But I hadn't reached there. I mean, I was like, okay, pehle log aaye, then we'll worry about that. And I was astounded, I have to say. It was just really humbling to see the queues. And I really felt bad that so many people couldn't actually get in to see the film. In fact, even today, somebody asked me whether there's a second screening, whether that's going to be a possibility. So, I mean, at that level, and to see a house full against your film is like super exciting for a docu-filmmaker. I think that's like a trip. It was wonderful. But I think more than that was actually to just feel the film with everybody. You know, to feel that they were making the connections, because they're the connections you're making, right, as a filmmaker, you don't know whether it's going to land and whether it's going to evoke that. But I felt in the questions in the ways in which people were talking to us, you know, about particular connections, even about some of the questions that you asked me. You know, it was really nice because it went beyond nostalgia. It went into some of the problematic areas, some of the questions that confront us today as a people who are getting more and more divided. And through the way, and I was able to talk about why I'm trying to make film a little differently now, and see whether one can do it with a certain kind of apparent levity, but talk with gravitas. And it was very fulfilling, I have to say. It was a delight. And I'm really happy I was here. I missed a lot of my crew yesterday. Had only 1 out of 5 key members, and I missed them a lot because it was a precious screening.
Okay. Congratulations again.
Thank
And
you.
thank you so much for your time.